I feel like I need to give a little bit of a caution or a warning this morning. I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, so I'm hoping that I'll make it through this morning and not choke up on you, but hopefully this will work fine as we go along. Our second reading today is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 through 23. The Apostle Paul is speaking. Paul says, "If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that my proclamation may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with all respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. So I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings." The gospel of the Lord, and we respond, "Praise to you, O Christ." Paul, in this letter to the Corinthians, is addressing some very practical concerns. Among the concerns the Corinthians being addressed by Paul is the concern about the work and compensation of the apostles like Paul himself. Paul suggests that apostles should be granted the same right as other laborers to earn a living from their work. He compares apostles to military and agricultural workers to highlight the point that workers deserve fair compensation. He goes so far as to say this right of apostles to earn a living from their ministry was in fact commanded by the Lord. In verse 14 of chapter 9, he says, "Those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." Then in our text today, Paul emphasizes the point that he himself has voluntarily waived his right to appropriate compensation, but only after making sure they understood he would be well within his rights to demand such compensation. So, having settled that practical issue about remuneration, Paul turns to what is the real revelation here in this text, and what may be promoting controversy among his people and about his ministry. And that is his evangelistic strategy. That strategy, as described in this text, can sound, wishy-washy. To the Jew, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. To the weak, I became weak. What? Is Paul's strategy to have a chameleon-like behavior, changing based on whomever he is around at the time? No, this is not the case, not Paul's strategy. Let me explain. Let's start with the fact that Paul was a Jew. So to become a Jew must mean something different because he was born as a Jew. But what Paul is really saying is he is seeking to connect to those of his own people, people who did not share his new understanding and practices. He has to care about a group of people who differ from him. As Frank Crouch summarizes, whether Jew or Gentile, under the law or outside the law, under the gospel or outside the gospel, strong or weak, seeker of things of Christ or seeker of things of the world, in order to connect with them and guide them to the fullness of life in Christ, Paul at least had to know them, to seek to understand them, try to see the world through their eyes, attempts to see the ways that they see their own stories. All this before telling them of the larger gospel story. In short, he had to care enough to know how to meet them on their own terms. Now that's all well and good, but if Paul were to write this letter today, I think he would have a theme of caring enough to meet the others on their own terms, but I think he would feel obligated to address one more issue. And that issue is that of judging the other, judgmentalism. Now, I'm going to ask, have you judged anyone lately? I'm guessing if you're honest with yourself, the answer will be yes, including me. Particularly if you include that person who made the left turn in front of me well after the light had changed, caused me to have to wait a whole 2 or 3 seconds. I must admit, I made significant judgment regarding that person's lineage, character, and motives. That may not actually be my or our worst case of judgmentalism. That's because judgmentalism is a basis for a lot of the isms, for racism, sexism, and almost any other ism that you can think of. We need to consider how judgmentalism may be impacting the church, its mission, and its ability to reach people. Reverend Carrie Newhoff recently did a post entitled 5 Ways Judgmental Christians Are Killing Your Church. For a self-identified evangelical, he is pretty blunt in his analysis and his self-analysis even. In the tradition of Paul, he points out that this is not really a matter of knowledge. If asked, you and I, like others, would likely say the right things about racism, poverty, and the like. But he would ask, what does the world see? What does the world see in your behavior? In particular, what does the unchurched person you are trying to reach see? He would point out the problem in many cases is not that unchurched people don't know any Christians. The problem is that they do, and they don't like them, sometimes for good reason. In his opinion, displays of judgmentalism is a key issue restricting the sharing of the gospel message. Judgmentalism, he contends, is incompatible with at least 5 Christian virtues that we cherish. Let's look at his list of 5 critical virtues. All 5 virtues which can help avoid judgmentalism. The first is love. Starting right there with Paul. Judgment almost always guarantees an absence of love. In the inverse, it is virtually impossible to love someone, whether that be a spouse or a friend or a coworker, and judge them at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean there will not be disagreements. There will be mistakes, missteps the person makes, that you make, that are tempting to have us jump over into righteous indignation. However, love would caution us to first look at our own mistakes and the depth of our own sin. First, deal with our own issues. In the process, we will encounter a loving God who forgives us despite our rather egregious sins. And having been loved, we can love others. Remember the premises. It is almost impossible, if I'm busy judging someone, to love them at the same time. And inversely, if I'm loving them, it's almost impossible to be judgmental. That naturally leads to the second virtue, and that is help. Have you ever noticed that people that first go to judgment are almost never very helpful? And have you noticed that people who help first are almost never seen to be judging? That is because judgment draws lines, creates barriers, pushes away. When Jesus taught on judgment, not only did he tell us not to judge, he told us to remove the massive timber from our own eye before trying the speck of dust in someone else's eye. But he then showed us the purpose of removing the speck from someone else's eye is to help them. Neglect of reality is not what's called for. Discernment of how to help in love is the Christian virtue we want others to see. The third of his 5 virtues is humility. It's very hard to be both humble and judgmental. This is because judgment almost always carries with it a sense of condescension. Judgment almost always moves in the direction of I'm better than you, I know more than you, I'm superior than you. No wonder people are repelled by it, will literally run from it. If our goal is to help, we need to recognize that it is a fact that the very people who get judged are not likely to be judged into a life change. However, many people are loved into a life change. Humility fosters empathy, says, I like you, maybe I can be useful, maybe we can help each other. Humbly loving and helping are virtues the world will see. The fourth of his list is not so much a virtue as a tool, and that is prayer. Prayer for and with, not prayer about. Prayer about slides back into judgment. Our first almost automatic response, like mine to the careless driver, might come out in anger, arrogance, and superiority, in short, judgment. Something like, Lord, how could you make that person such an idiot? That is not a prayer for. Prayer for is grounded in humility and love with the goal of help. Lord, I pray that person can find a way to make better decisions that do not imperil himself and others. If you want to stop judging someone, try praying for them. Not about, for. It's almost impossible to judge someone and truly pray for them at the same time. The fifth and final virtue highlighted by Neuhoff is evangelism. Again, in my mind, this is a tool, not a virtue. But if our intent is sharing the message and teachings of Jesus Christ, the very definition of evangelism, we must recognize that judgmentalism sends people away. Think about what you do. Likely you run from, or at least try to avoid, people who judge you and others. They are not very pleasant to be around. Remember, God never asked you to judge the world. God asked you to love. God asks you to share the message to the ends of the earth. Now, I've got to admit, there's a great deal of irony in the fact that I'm doing a sermon, a statement on judging and judgmentalism. Seems like a little bit hypocritical, and perhaps it is. I fully recognize that I can be as much a part of the problem as the next person. However, if this critique strikes you as harsh, remember that Jesus' harshest words were reserved for the arrogant, judgmental leaders inside the faith. Conversely, Jesus was pretty much never harsh to people trying to follow, or even those outside the faith. But let's close by going back to our text for today. Back to Paul's strategy. Paul makes it clear his model is not to stand away or judge the world. His method of evangelism, in his own words, is, "For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them." There is a significant distinction between judgment and being one with, although a difficult one to maneuver. Paul does this for the sake of the gospel, so that he can share the blessings of the good news, relating to becoming one with the Jew, the ones under the law, the ones outside the law, and the weak. He became all things to all people, that he might by all means save. Love, help, show humility, pray, and share the word. Sounds like a pretty good strategy to me. Amen.